Hey everybody, thank you for joining me today to take a look at the Nikon F100. But first I'd like to thank Yasuyoshi Shimura. His friends call him Yosh, and he's a dealer out of Japan of some really fine film camera equipment. And he offered to send me this Nikon F100 to review, so Yosh, thank you very much for that. Everybody, go check out his store. It's linked below. He carries some really amazing equipment in some really good condition, and he's got a stellar reputation. So go check out that link below and see what he's got to offer. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Nikon F100. So this is one of Nikon's high-end film SLRs. It was introduced in 1999 and then discontinued in 2006. People look at the F100 as a scaled-down F5, and if you've ever seen an F5, it's got the vertical grip over here, so it's a lot bulkier and a lot heavier. The Nikon F100 does not have that grip, so it's a little bit more compact than the F5. So the big features that Nikon touted for this camera are its 5 autofocus points. Personally, I only use one of those, the one right in the center, and I just focus and recompose. I really don't use those other autofocus points, but they are there if you want to use them. It's got what is called dynamic AF, or dynamic autofocus, and what that is, when you switch that mode on, is you set the focus point that you want to use. For example, you set the center point as your focus point, but if the camera senses that the subject moves, it'll switch to a different autofocus point, so it'll keep autofocus on that subject. It also features what Nikon calls its 10-segment 3D matrix meter, otherwise known as the matrix meter. If you are a Nikon fan, or if you've ever spoken to a Nikon fan, you know that they talk about the Nikon matrix meter with a lot of reverence as being a really accurate meter, and we're going to go into that a little later on for sure. It's got 22 customizable settings, and I'm not going to go over all of those. I'm just going to go over a few that were the most relevant to my experience in shooting this camera. It's got a metal body. It's made out of magnesium alloy, and it's coated in a grippy rubber, so it feels really good in your hands. So because it's a metal body, that of course is going to add to its weight, but you know, that's where your trade-off is with sturdiness, and this is a very sturdy feeling camera. Okay, so let's take a look at the front of the Nikon F100. Here you've got a sync port for external flashes or strobes. This is a 10-pin remote terminal, and it takes a whole bunch of different accessories that are detailed in the manual, but a couple of notable ones are, of course, a remote shutter release, and also there's a cable for controlling 2 F100s at the same time. I don't know how that's done, but apparently it can be done. Over here you've got the button that releases the lens. Right below that you've got your autofocus settings, manual, single, and continuous autofocus. And then over here you've got your depth of field preview button. And that is that's actually really loud. If the camera's on, if you can hear that, you can hear those aperture blades, or you can see those aperture blades closing, but the camera sounds like it is taking a photograph. I'm not really sure why it's that loud. The mirror doesn't go up when it does that, but you can definitely hear that thing. And then right here you've got your sub command dial. Okay, here we are taking a look at the top of the camera. You've got over here, you've got your dial that controls your drive mode, so basically single and continuous. You've got your bracketing switch, you've got a flash mode switch, and you've got this ISO switch here. And what that ISO switch does is you can manually override the DX code of a film canister if for example, you have film that is either expired and you want to shoot it an extra stop, you want to add an extra stop of exposure, or if you have some film that doesn't have a DX code and for the camera to sense, then you can manually input the ISO that you want the camera to shoot at, that you want the camera to meter at. You've got your hot shoe over here, and over here on the right, you've got your on-off switch right there. You've got a mode button, which basically, if you want to change your modes, you hold that, and you can go from manual to program to basically shutter priority, where you choose the shutter speed and the camera chooses the aperture speed, or aperture priority, where you choose the aperture and the camera chooses the shutter speed. Again, in my testing, I just shot in manual. You've got your shutter button, obviously, and then you've got your exposure compensation switch. So if you're shooting in an auto mode, like for example, program, then you can hold that button down and you can tell the camera to overexpose by or underexpose by a third of a stop, a seventh, or a whole stop. So basically in third stop increments all the way down to plus or minus 5 stops. Over here on the right, you've got your metering switch. So basically your options here are spot, matrix, and I think that third one is basically an average meter. So the matrix meter is, you know, the famous Nikon matrix meter that's just really accurate, and it's really hard to fool. So I always just keep it on that matrix meter position. This button over here is what unlocks this dial when you want to spin that dial to a different drive mode. I just shoot in single, so I just keep it in S right there, and that dial, unless you press it down, that dial will not move. So you can't accidentally bump that dial. So that's a nice little touch there. Okay, so let's take a look at the back of the camera. You've got your custom function button, which you hold that. You hold that to change your custom functions. You can lock your aperture and shutter speed with this lock button, so you can't accidentally bump the setting if you want to lock that. You've got a metering on and your AF on switch. This turns dynamic AF on and off. So basically, that's dynamic AF on. That's dynamic AF off. That's just basically regular AF. And again, dynamic AF is a mode where you choose the autofocus point, but if the camera senses that your subject moves, it'll follow your subject and move AF points. This is your autofocus position selector. So you can see there, if you can see that, you can lock that into place. Right now it's unlocked, so you can choose your autofocus point, or you can lock it so that you can't accidentally bump it, so it doesn't move when it's locked into place. And then you've got your main command dial here. And then a nice little touch here is that it's got a diopter. So if you wear glasses and you need to adjust for your vision, then you've got that diopter that you can adjust there. That comes in really handy if you wear glasses like I do. Okay, so let's talk about the custom settings. Now, there are 22 custom settings, and like I said earlier, I'm not going to go over all of them. I'm just going to go over the ones that I felt were the most relevant to me. Now, with most any modern digital SLR, these custom settings are things that you can change in the menu of the camera. Now, because we don't have the benefit of a big computer screen on the back of this thing, since it's a film camera, these custom settings are changed by holding down this custom settings button and then spinning this dial. And so you can see the top LED there kind of switching, basically going through the menu as I hold down this custom setting button. So it's basically done as a combination of button presses and dials to change those custom settings. So let's go over a few of the custom settings that I felt were important. So custom setting 1 is the auto film rewind. So by default, when this camera reaches the end of a roll of film, it does not rewind automatically. So what you have to do is you have to press the bracket button and the exposure compensation button at the same time, and there are little red markers with that film rewind symbol next to them. And so that tells you when you're at the end of the roll, when you want to rewind your film back into the cassette, you have to press both of these buttons at the same time, which the camera is empty now, but I'm going to go ahead and do that. And you can hear it rewinding. So you push those buttons, you hold them for about 1 or 2 seconds, and it'll start rewinding the film. Now with the custom setting, you can make it so that the film rewinds automatically like it would with many other automatic cameras or point and shoots. Okay, now with custom setting 2, that changes your exposure value steps with your aperture and your shutter to 1 stop, half stops, or third stops. Default is 1/3 stops. So in other words, with your main and sub command dials, when you're changing either your shutter speed or your aperture setting, it changes it by default in third stop increments. Now you can change that to be half stop increments, or you can change that to be whole stop increments. I really prefer the more precise control, so I leave it at the default of third stops, but you have the option of a full stop and a half stop if you want to change to those. Okay, moving on to custom function 4. So that has to do with the AF on button in the back. So the default setting is that the camera autofocuses either by half pressing the shutter button, which is, really common with most cameras. So when you half press that shutter button, it'll autofocus, but it will also autofocus and lock with the press of the AF on button. Now, the default setting is the camera autofocuses with either or of those. You can use both of those to engage autofocus. I prefer to turn off the autofocus on the shutter button and to only have the autofocus on the AF on button. That's what people commonly refer to as back button autofocus, if you've ever heard that term. And the reason I prefer that is because I like to grab and lock focus with this button, and then I don't want the autofocus to hunt every time I half press the shutter. I want to control when the autofocus will engage, basically, and I don't want it to hunt and potentially lose autofocus every time I half press that shutter button. So basically, I turn off that setting to have it off autofocus on the shutter button and only have it autofocus with this one. It affords me a little bit more control. I started doing it back when I was shooting with Canon SLRs, and I've really just come to prefer that level of control so that it's not always hunting for focus when I don't want it to hunt for focus. Okay, so the final custom function that I'm going to go over is custom function 12, and that is switching the operation between the main and the sub command dials. Now, why is that? It's because I come from shooting Canon SLRs, and basically with a Canon SLR, you control shutter speed with your front dial, and you control aperture with the wheel on the back. So if you're familiar with Canon, you know what I'm talking about. There's a wheel on the back, and you spin that. That'll control your aperture, and this will control your shutter speed. Now that is different on Nikon. So basically what you have is, by default, with Nikon, you're going to change your aperture with what they call the sub command dial. That's the dial on the front. And then you change your shutter speed with the main command dial, which is the dial on the back. So I like to switch that. I'm more comfortable with changing my shutter speed with the front dial and changing my aperture with the back dial. Purely a point of preference. And that's really, again, basically because I come from shooting Canon SLRs when I was shooting SLRs. So I like to be able to change that setting. Okay, so let's talk about my shooting experience with this camera. First and foremost, to me, this camera is heavy. It's made of metal. It's a modern SLR, and it's stuffed with a lot of electronic components, so that's going to add to its weight and size, especially if you're shooting, like, for example, for me, if you're used to shooting with manual SLRs, like, for example, this Nikon FM2, or even smaller stuff like this Pentax MX, there's going to be a size and a weight difference. That, however, is not to say that it's not a pleasure to hold. I mean, ergonomically, it just fits in your hand so well. You know, it's the way it's molded and the way it's shaped. It fits in your hand so well. It feels great. You know, the corners kind of fit in your palm like that, and it's just a really terrific shooting experience. I use a strap. I use this strap. It's an Optec. It's got a little bit of padding, so I recommend a wider strap because it is a heavier camera. And when I say heavy, it's relatively heavy. You know, I mean, it's not really heavier than it should be, if that makes sense. I mean, it's again, ergonomically, it fits great in your hands. The weight does feel good, and it does feel sturdy. But, you know, if you are coming from a manual rangefinder or a manual SLR, there's going to be naturally a weight difference there. Okay, so let's get a little nitpicky here. I had mentioned that this thing feels really sturdy, and I'm sure that it is. I've heard many stories of these being just so reliable for many, many people, and I believe it. You know, it seems like Nikon really built these things to last. They seem like they are very reliable cameras. However, there are a couple of points where I feel on the camera some switches feel a little fragile. Like, for example, this metering switch here, which you switch that by pressing the button down and then spinning it to your desired metering mode. That switch feels really fragile. It feels weak, and it feels like it might break under a heavy touch, which I don't have a super heavy touch, but just, you know, in comparison to the rest of the camera, which feels super solid, super sturdy, that switch in particular, along with the focus mode switch, you've got your modes here of manual, single, and continuous autofocus modes. That switch also feels a little fragile. Just in relation to the rest of the camera, feeling so solid, and feeling like it's a really strong camera, those switches, along with, finally, the diopter switch, that feels like, it kind of feels like you can pull it right off. So, I mean, you're not going to mess with the diopter switch a whole lot. You're just going to set it to the setting that you need it to be. But if you were to, I feel like if you were to drop the camera in a certain way and it hit that diopter switch, that thing would snap right off. Those three things in relation to the rest of the camera feel relatively fragile. Okay, so now that we've looked at the camera, let's take a look at some photos. Okay, so we're taking a look at some photographs that I took with the F100, and all of these photographs were taken with the 50mm f1.4D lens. So this first picture, like I had mentioned earlier, I was trying to throw some exposure situations at the F100's meter that I think were a little bit on the difficult side. And these rocks in the marina, basically at the shoreline of the marina near where I live, the sun was setting. It was about an hour out from setting, so it was a really difficult angle, or a kind of an extreme angle to the horizon. So you know, a lot of shadows, a lot of kind of specular highlights from some of the rocks down there, and so yeah, I think the F100 handled the exposure pretty well. I think it balanced really well between the highlights and the shadows, and it would kind of put the exposure right where I would have put it. And this is not an especially difficult situation. I mean, there's the light and dark and midtones are pretty evenly mixed throughout the scene, but you know, I just kind of wanted a high contrast situation to see how the meter would handle that. The next photograph is again near the shoreline, near some fence between the walkway and the beach, essentially. And I just wanted to see, you know, some extreme highlights and extreme shadows, and how the meter would treat that. And the meter handled the scene pretty well. The next photograph, it wasn't, I think it was the following day, but it wasn't quite a difficult situation. It's pretty evenly bright across the scene there. So, I mean, nothing that I don't think many average meters couldn't really handle. So, but it turned out sharp. It, you know, especially kind of shows off the optics of the lens. You know, you're watching this on YouTube, so you're not really going to see the high resolution scan of this photograph, but the lens performs really well. The next one is a portrait of a fellow in town. His name's Ricky, and I asked him to just kind of pose for a portrait real quick, and he agreed. I've taken a bunch of pictures of him before, and again, this one was a little later in the day, so there's kind of a harder angle on him there, and the meter worked pretty well. He, you know, the scene behind him was lit pretty brightly. The sun is kind of hitting him from a rear angle, and you know, he's not quite backlit. There's some sun coming across his face there, but the camera handled the exposure really well. And again, you know, with any of these scenes, I didn't use any kind of compensation where, you know, with many other cameras where I think the meter might be fooled into thinking an exposure might be one thing, where I would disagree with a meter and maybe expose it one way or the other with more or less exposure. I didn't do that with the F100. I basically made sure the meter was right in the middle because I wanted to see what the meter or how the meter would respond to all of these scenes. This next one was a picture of some birds. I was trying to get as close as I can to these pigeons, and I couldn't get super close before they flew away. But the autofocus, the Nikon's autofocus, was able to nail them kind of mid-flight there. Yeah, again, impressive autofocus. One of the highlights of a camera like this is the autofocus system and how convenient that can be when it's one less thing that you have to think about. Here's another high contrast scene. I can't remember what time of day this was, but anyway, it's in the marina nearby where I live, and we've got some strong shadows on the left here, and then on the right we've got a bunch of like white boats and water with specular highlights being hit by some direct sunlight. So again, the meter proved to be accurate. And the skyline of it's actually right outside of my bedroom. I have a bedroom on the second floor, and looking right outside of that bedroom, this is what I see there. That's the Carquinez Strait. You can see some big oil tankers, either oil tankers or cargo ships across the bay there, yeah, just a high contrast scene, and the meter performed fine. This one was one of the trickier ones. These are little Barbie doll dresses. I was coming home one day. It was late. The sun had just about set. Or you know what? I think the sun was either setting or had just set. I mean, within a minute or so. But it's pretty backlit. Those are Barbie doll dresses hanging on a clothesline, and they were, really, really strongly backlit. So, with a scene like that, I knew it was going to be the subject in the foreground was going to be really shadowy. So normally I would tell the camera to expose one extra stop. So I would open up, or the aperture one extra stop, or slow down the shutter by one extra stop, depending on what the meter told me. But again, I did not do that with the F100. I just did it right in the middle, just to see how the meter would behave, and it behaved really well. It exposed the scene exactly how I would have exposed it, which is just to add a little bit of extra exposure so that the elements in the foreground are exposed, and that you're catching those details even in the shadows, even with this really strongly backlit scene. So this next photograph was a car right outside of my office. It had a really interesting illustration along, on a white car, yeah, kind of fairly high contrast, but nothing too challenging here for a meter. This is right outside of my office. The building is painted like this eggshell white, or kind of like a beige or whatever, and in certain sunlight it kind of looks like it glows really brightly against an overcast sky, and that's what I had here. It looked like it was glowing, and it can be a really tricky high contrast scene, and again, the Nikon's meter worked great. This one is a tree stump right outside the office. Again, this was later in the day, kind of a bit more of a challenging scene. I actually would have preferred a little less exposure on this. I would have maybe a third or 2/3 of a stop less exposure. I think the highlights on the right side of the image are a little too bright. I mean, there's nothing that some adjustment can't fix, but I would have let the shadows on the left fall a little lower, a little darker, and to catch a little bit more of the highlights on the right side of the image. So this was really the only kind of somewhat tricky one that the meter didn't really perform exactly how I would have wanted it to. and then yet another high contrast scene. This was really early in the morning. The sun was just coming up. It was about, I don't know, it was a little after 6 a.m. and really high contrast scene, really heavily backlit, and you know, I just metered for the scene. You know, I didn't meter for the lower part or the upper part. I just metered exactly for what you see here, and shot it accordingly, and the meter did what I wanted it to. And this is my son, and yeah, it's just a picture of my son. I thought it was cute, so I thought I'd include it. This is window light. He's standing right in front of a window. And in fact, you can see me in the catch light of his eyes. That's my head right there. And he's always hamming it up for the camera because I'm always taking pictures, and he's always willing. So anyway, so yeah, the first 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 photographs that we looked at were Ilford HP5, and the last set of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 photographs that we looked at were all Japan Camera Hunter StreetPan 400. So yeah, all in all, really happy with the Nikon F100 and how it performed. Really happy with the meter, which is kind of a big part of what I wanted to test about this thing, because I've never really put the Nikon's matrix meter to the test. But I'd say it's all it's cracked up to be, and you know, I wouldn't hesitate to trust it in really difficult situations. Okay guys, so in closing this thing out, this is an amazing technical marvel of a camera. I mean, it's really comfortable to hold, it is fun to shoot, autofocus is fast and accurate, metering is accurate. You have so much control over every aspect of this camera that you can customize or change, or you can give control to the camera completely. I mean, you can basically turn this camera into a really fast point and shoot if you want to shoot in program mode and just automate all the functions, or you could make everything completely manual. You can even focus manually if you wanted to do that. You have so many choices with this camera. So this was a lot of fun to shoot. I see myself shooting a lot more with this camera, and I even see myself growing this Nikon lens system, because the lens, this particular 50mm lens that I tested with this camera, was a really spectacular lens. The photographs to me looked really sharp, just really rendered beautifully, and I see myself using this camera a lot. So thank you everybody for joining me on this review. Thank you again to Yosh for sending me this camera. Make sure to check out his eBay store listed below. He's an excellent, stellar dealer, and I look forward to the next camera review. Thanks guys for joining me, and I'll see you on the next one.